Hello everyone, today we introduce a topic that we will have to discuss further in at least other three videos respectively about Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, the struggle between Philip IV and Boniface VIII that we actually discussed but we'll have to expand on once again, and one on Ludwig the Bavarian, Ludwig of Wittelsbach, Louis IV of the Holy Roman Empire that is about specifically the many aspects as we'll see today, but fundamentally it gets down to the end of universalism, or better, the beginning of the end of universalism. Of course, universalism didn't die in the Middle Ages, but definitely those secularizing and even nationalizing, we'll talk specifically about this without anachronism today, processes that will culminate eventually with the nation state at the end of the 18th, and eventually, with a juridical sanction at the beginning of the 19th, at least in France, and spreading from there in the rest of Europe, have objectively certain important roots, right? That in my videos I don't want to sound ideological, but it unavoidably happens anytime I obviously choose a narrative to explain a certain historical phenomenon. And as you know, I openly criticize the concept that I always tell you to contextualize everything that happens historically speaking, so that you can even come to judge it from your moral standards. We should always ask, why should I do that, right? It's not that we cannot judge morally everything that happens in the past. As far as I'm concerned, I can judge everything I want, right? The problem is why, right? And with which goals specifically. And this, in our times, and also, in the past, has been being done in a very unthoughtful way, usually for the context proper, right? There is nothing bad in stating that these were pretty messed up times by many standards that should be eminently scientific, right? Biological, even if you want, right? There is probably something that is functional for every era, but what we often underestimate is actually that the motives for which certain things happened in the past were way more powerful than what we think today, because today we have much more freedom to spend. Those times there wasn't, and not because people were imposed from the above, right? There has never been a historical moment like today in which we are imposed from the above, and this is no negative thing either, right? Even in here there is a context, and states have never been as powerful as in this very moment, historically speaking. In those times they weren't, so there is not even the narrative of the terrible oppressor that in the past oppressed everybody else. People did astonishingly horrifying things, as we still do today, but at least there was a degree of fluidity that doesn't allow us to say, it was just because of this person or that person. It was a systematic dynamic. Very often, think about, even things like slavery, or, systematic exterminations or rapes or whatever, abuses of every kind. We know this stuff happened basically in every single culture historically, and if you wonder why it was just evil, right? Well, it's not a very considered way of addressing the question if you're interested in the historical explanation of the thing. Of course it was evil, but also why did it happen exactly, right? What is that generated this in some ways, and was all of it evil? Was it just determined by the circumstances? That is, if I don't take your land, I starve to death, for example, to take the migration era. That was substantially it, right? Historically speaking, this is being explained in various ways. At some point we thought these were just the brutal barbarians that arrived and killed everybody because they were a bunch of barbarians, right? Now there is the thing, it was just a migration, right? Nothing bad happened. Well, no. Yes, it was a migration, and it was a migration as much as an invasion, and bad things did really happen. But there is a balanced view that is about, okay, there was a migration, there was an invasion, things happened, people interacted with each other, sometimes they killed each other, sometimes they did something constructive together, and especially what it seems and striking, historically speaking, is that they didn't seem so prejudiced after all, right? To deal in dynamic terms that also express a pretty substantial intelligence in that regard. I don't know why I'm talking about this right now, but it's also to say that I express myself in favorable terms often, in trying to explain why certain things happened, right? And sometimes they triggered people, right? Trying to explain, for example, why the Albigensian Crusade wasn't properly a maniacal genocide caused by the evil of the papacy, right? And why there was an enormous amount of political and social, assets at stake. Not just quantitatively, as we're talking about in terms of social organization, also the same religious views. My way of explaining history is always trying to make you reflect once again on what could even produce such a thing. Because if we assume that certain entities, because let's be honest about this, we emerge from a world that is brutally influenced from the very, and very intelligent and clever propagandas that have always been used historically speaking, right? It's obvious that, I don't know, if you take Christianity, look at, for example, Western Christendom, you look at Catholics and Protestants, right? It's dramatically easy to see in a Protestant or Catholic country. It doesn't matter if people even maybe don't believe in God anymore. That has no importance whatsoever, because this is the beauty of it, right? That we think to have been emancipated from all this. So we think to have grown so mentally autonomous and free and intelligent. The masses reason exactly, and I stress this, exactly, right, with the same ideological tools that were taught, and in those times imposed, while today they're not imposed anymore to do so, to read history, for example, in a certain way, right? There is an enormous, for example, anti-papal prejudice in Protestant countries. There is an enormous, equally, anti-Protestant prejudice in Catholic countries, and stressing the idea of barbarity and primitivity in those cultures. It's always like that. It's always been like that, and we do reason in those terms exactly because those are things we remember because they poured in through somewhere, right? Even in the history books, even from the age of nationalism at the highest, with 100 years ago. Our grandfathers were there, or, at least, but even very recently in time, up to 20 years ago, nobody, was particularly bothered to be a nationalist, right? Today, we're starting to pose ourselves some questions and say, but is that really something functional? Is anything that ends in ism, for that matter, something intelligent to believe in the first place? And turns out it is not, right? And it is not because it pretends to explain the world that is, the most complicated thing you can imagine, with a monofactorial interpretation, which is just what we figured out with, intensive and extensive schooling spreading throughout the world. That is exactly how dumb people reason. And this is not a matter of what kind of ism you believe in, right? It's about nationalism, it's about racism, it's about communism, it's about masculinism, feminism, socialism. It's everything that ends in ism is by definition idiocy, right? It doesn't serve to any purpose if not to know that it exists, so that you can spot the idiot that believes in that. And this is what I always encourage to do: discriminate stupid people. There is no other valid way for discriminating a person except people who are stupid, because people who are stupid are really creating a big problem to the world war, and we are all stupid in large, right? So it's a work that we have started doing mostly from ourselves. So I always say these things because I presume there are lots of people who come on this channel looking at, this is the channel who talks about my country, right, my people, to think, this guy really wants to parade my own delusions. No, I don't. This channel is not for you, right? There are a lot of idiotic things that you can look at on YouTube. This is kind of not, at least that kind, right? That type. There is plenty of this stuff around, don't come here. Because here we just try to make people improve in their mind. If you arrive at a certain point in your life in which you think that everything you had to learn, you have it, that you have those fundamentals, it's those rights, right? They're the good one. Yeah, this is not a channel for you, right? Because this channel is based on the belief that you can improve yourself and become a better person endlessly, right? And infinitely, right? So stopping to one point is a declaration of personal failure. And it's unfortunately dramatically widespread. And I don't know what I'm talking about this once again, but it started from the fact that I wanted to stress the existence, of course, within the so-called Ancien Régime of surely national characters too. As you see, I express myself in anti-nationalistic terms, not because I have something specifically against nationalism more than I have towards all the other isms, but because, as I was saying, now I come to talk about countries, peoples, nationalities, and so on in history. So this is like trying to form an antibody for everybody who's listening. So that to say, either it depends on how you react to it, but it can't fail, evidently, because I triggered a lot of people by addressing the thing in these terms. But exactly because today we talk about even something like the emergence of national feelings in a certain sense, we should always distinguish something national from something nationalistic, right? It is not wrong to look at the Middle Ages and say, look, here's something that, basically had enucleated very embryonally or, primitively the concept of modern nation, for example, in which I live in, existed, right? And it's not historically wrong, right? As long as you accept that it existed, first of all, alongside a lot of other beliefs, some of which were prevalent, such as universalism, for example, in the very moment we're talking about, that is much subtler, right? And not necessarily, like, this is not the happy storytelling saying, there were national feelings, but they weren't like the evil nationalism. These were kind of good, neutral things. No, these were bad, already from this point, right? Like most of things that humans do, generally speaking, all the ways they try to discriminate on certain, a religious base or not, we have to talk about, for example, also the concept of tolerance. We often think that, at a certain point, in the 19th century, 20th century, nationalism arrived, and in certain areas of Europe, especially Central and Eastern, ethnic cleansing happened, genocide happened. It is true, technically, but what was happening before was also not like a peaceful coexistence or integration or tolerance in the way we stress, right? I would have a lot to say also about which Europes we're talking about, because the more I look around and the more I realize, and I'm sorry because this will offend someone, but that there was not one Europe, as there is not today, right? There is not one area of Europe that is homogeneous in the sense, people are brilliant and intelligent, or I believe that actually the West has something, has developed throughout history something more, I can't say more advanced specifically, but, the way, for example, we wrote history, since Thucydides or Xenophon, it's something that objectively doesn't exist in any other area of the world. And when we think about these other areas of the world, we have to often to acknowledge that this is not the boundaries sometimes enter even within the same Europe, right? There are not certain countries of Europe that simply because now we're buying ethno-nationalism, right? People just say, how can I find a way to feel special even though I'm a complete failure? what I look like, for example, how white you look, or whatever, other color you want to look, and pretending that contains your culture, your deep values, which actually seem to have become proximal to zero, even if they had ever existed in positive terms. Lack of education, poor schooling, this idea you cannot fit into a system that, unless the system in that sense, unless that system is forgetting what the West has properly been. And this is not to condone, also I'm talking about the West in very approximate terms, because I don't like even the term in the way it's being formulated, and we should talk more about this topic because I've never quite defined it, but there is something that looks and sounded like it, right? This is not to condone, say, the best is, the best, the West is the best, right? Or, we should condone everything that has been done simply because we emerged from that, right? This is not the point either. That's also pretty stupid and uninteresting fundamentally, even especially for me. I never liked it very much. But we gotta be honest about the fact that, of course, this thing is faulty and whatever, but the rest outside of it is far worse. And to to masochistically atone for things that you have never done, because I don't know about you, but as a Western, I never, enslaved anyone, or I never, exploited anyone, or I never, I might have exploited someone, but I don't think, more or less than, what on average people do all over the world in terms of personal relations. We all do, right? Nobody is devoid of sin, but this dichotomy, it's either, pure pride for being born in one country, having the skin of one color, is as stupid as saying, let's destroy that culture because the people in the past did something, violent people, but were people in general, right? Also, let's see who they were and why they were doing that, right? Because this is what the reason is that this is not, there's such a debate in the world today, not because there is an improvement in the actual quality of thinking. That's why I ask you to go back and read stuff, when we read von Clausewitz or other authors at that time, because we got to one point that, those authors got to one point that if we rose up to, on average, in the masses, instead of tweeting garbage and trying to feel puritanically rightful in everything we do, we just, we're humble enough to maybe to pick some book and start reading it and trying to understand, in an intellectually honest way what it's written in it, and then not passively, accepting what it's written, but actually developing a critical sense, where the world would be much better, right? And I make these videos exactly to stress this. You wonder, some of you sometimes says, but is it necessary really that you talk about this stuff when I want to know about, the detachment of, the Kingdom of France or the Holy Roman Empire from the papal spheres that I'm trying to approach now? The point is, yes, actually, because what started at that point is also the reason why we're talking about such things. Indirectly, yes, but what's indirect, historically speaking, this all contributed to form our own views, to form our own way of thinking. So, as I was saying before, if you don't like this, fine. If you like it, it's fine as well. Just know that I don't just say it anecdotal, right? Sometimes I have just to vent, or I am in bad mood or stuff like this, but I care about this abandonment of fanatic attitudes from whichever side, right? And I don't want to be fanatic myself, right? Except just maybe in the fact that, of course, if someone says something constructed and kind of intelligent, maybe we should start listening rather than pretending we already know while we actually don't. And it's extremely easy to be scared by the unknown and not wanting to know it. We are programmed genetically to do it, right? But that happened when we were out there in the wild. Now it's very different, and we cannot afford this anymore. So we have reason, we can exercise it. Fortunately, just it doesn't seem we're very fond of it. So, yes, this is what I wanted to talk to you about today. Properly, it's just a way of seeing it, right? Before I introduced the topic as the end of universalism, but there was something national proper, even in certain other trends, as I was anticipating. We're talking fundamentally about the low and late Middle Ages, even arriving at the thresholds of the modern age, and even in the early 16th century up to the Protestant Reform. As we have explained multiple times, the Middle Ages can be read like up to the end of the 13th and mid-14th century as this great civilization that emerged fundamentally starting from the 8th, the 9th, the 10th century, depending also on the areas of Europe, from this reawakening post-ancient times, in the contraction of late antiquity, that took the forms of an incredible civilization about which we don't know much about. Right, we can't start tracking it, fortunately. Of course, the West is dramatically documented compared to other areas of Europe, but properly before the crisis, this is also something I often stress, it's very important, there was this enormous system. We don't even know how many people lived in there, right? We have these enormous relics, like 80 cathedrals built all over, built all over Europe, something never seen before, right? We have discussed this unspeakably astonishing phenomenon that happened with medieval civilization, apparently out of the blue, just apparently out of the blue. We're not going to discuss it today. At a certain point, though, for reasons that also we don't have the time to discuss either, or we did elsewhere, anyhow, multiple times, contracted, right? It didn't, it cracked fundamentally, and it even collapsed within itself at a certain point, right? It just, remained standing, right? Differently from ancient world that, contrarily to what is commonly believed, didn't have this huge potential in itself. The medieval civilization is something that didn't die out, right? It basically coped with the crisis exactly, giving birth to what we know as properly the modern age, which is a term I don't like at all, right? I like to stress as much, you have to, to give me my medievalist bias, that the modern age is mostly fundamentally Middle Ages, right? There is a long Middle Age that stretches up to this either 1789 or 1918, depending on the areas in Europe, that that managed not to collapse, in fact, not to disappear, to change face, but probably to strengthen its own base, strengthen its own institutions, its own politics, its own social structures, and so on, right? And that's what we call, in fact, the Ancien Régime, right? It's what it's being called, in a negative sense, also at the time of the French Revolution, but that is something so big objectively in the history of Europe, in the history actually of most other countries, because most other countries were exactly the same to that. Most other continents actually. The modern, let's be honest, even here the nation state is just a Western exception. We invented that. There was nothing like that elsewhere that, and it especially couldn't emerge like it did in Europe, and we still live within it. Even here, I will not discuss whether it's been a positive or negative thing, because, as you know, I tend to be balanced. I don't, even here, I see the rise of nation state for reasons that are objectively understandable. So it's not a matter of justifying it, but just motivating it. I say this because many of you say, "Oh, you're another one that loves the older world." No, I don't actually. Right, the older world sucked badly, right? And I would have not liked to live in there. I would like to see it. It's one of my greatest dreams. I would throw away 10 years of life just for spending 1 minute to see what the Middle Ages actually were. but it's not because I would have liked to live in them, and there was not something specifically pure, honest, just, beautiful in it, in the sense as some deluded people would like to think of it. Just like there is not in the modern reality, except we have dramatically improved living conditions that every medieval person would have just sold everything they had and more just to reach just to having one 100th of it. Right. But aside from this, this world cracked, and together with it cracked this major, view of it that had been building in the previous centuries. Most of this had to do properly with universalism. That is something even in here that is not specifically Western. It has nothing actually peculiar. It's something that happened everywhere in the world. But that in Europe had taken a specific, and specifically in Western Europe, because also, for example, the Orthodox world wasn't like that, or better, it was it, but in different forms. That is this continuous, I would say, dialogue or negotiation or struggle, but it's all about the same thing between the spiritual and the secular power. We made some video about the investiture controversy. It's so cute as it sounds in the English names. I prefer struggle because these were wars that engulfed some of the most important countries in Europe at this point, and it influenced the whole continent at the roots. Right, it was not just a controversy; it was something seriously bad. That, however, spurred also incredibly, from an intellectual point of view, and from a politically theoretical point of view, religiously, doctrinal point of view, the mind, the intelligence, the development of the West. And that's also why we talk about different areas of Europe, right? Because different areas of Europe didn't grow at the same in the same way in this trend, right? Consider always that there is this broader Mediterranean world that was dramatically more advanced since the ancient world that poured this continuous waves of properly of culture and civilization up to the north for centuries and centuries. And the rest of Europe actually did a pretty good job, especially during medieval times, in assimilating this. And that's also what we should, however, all remember when in Europe we try to be kind of jerky, one against the other for reasons can even have surely motivated root, but that shouldn't in fact let us indulge towards things like let's start discriminating once again each other, and let's break down this thing that you don't even understand historically what it's been like, because a person like that starts creating this crisis is a person that doesn't care the slightest about Western civilization, contrarily wise to what they think in communitarist terms, identitarian terms, and there are many paradoxes even in this regard that derive exactly from not knowing this crucial times that the Middle Ages are. Why universalism was there, right? And why had the struggle for ambassadors basically rise? Well, this also we have discussed this at length, but if you want to be brutally and unfairly concise, we could explain it exactly because of the absence of a centralized state, right? Western Europe did do dramatically well compared to areas like, I don't know, even the same Byzantine Empire, for this controversy, as we want to call it, right? The clash, the confrontation, the conflict proper creates civilization, right? If you wish to live in a world in which there are no passions, no clashes, no contradictions, at least let's address them in the right sense, right? And there would be plenty of reasons, right? including, I don't know, the fact that there is still a communist superpower that causes directly a global pandemics, right? And nobody gives a damn about it. That arrests people, that kills them, that occupies other countries, and that deports entire populations and takes away children from their parents and indoctrinates them to their delusion, right? Let's concentrate on that, like, instead of discriminating each other for stupid reasons of sort. That's the bad guy, right? And that's not all bad. So you have also to understand what kind of options you have of it. But that's just an example, just not to sound hypocrite, to say that conflict and war even, right? But politically, military, socially, is the sap of civilization. A civilization that is flat, where nothing happens, everything is crystallized, dies, right? This is what happened pretty clearly in many situations. Think about the same China back in the day, in the 19th century. 1 century before, it was simply the largest power in the world. The century afterward was eaten alive by all these, European colonialists. Why do you think it happened, right? You see that division sometimes is strength, as long as it has naturally its own logic, its own intelligence within it. This time, maybe the card of division is not really good for Europe at all, considering the forces that are pressing against it from multiple sides. We could think of the same Byzantine Empire. The fact that the contrast between the emperor and the patriarchy that did exist in Constantinople, right, but was reduced to something that is not even remotely comparable with what happened in the Holy Roman Empire in the West, and more generally in the West broadly meant, aside even just from the boundaries of that empire that technically had to encompass actually the whole Western Europe, that we have started to reason as if it was just like a sort of Germanic nation state, as if we lived in Victorian times and we couldn't read medieval maps in a more intelligent fashion. Universalism plays a very important card in a moment where the nation state doesn't work, and this is in part also the leitmotif of today's videos, because we will see that through the crisis of universalism, national feelings, national monarchies, even the states we could start talking about. Surely France at the end of the Middle Ages is moving very fast toward that direction. That are both causes and consequences at the same time, right? Think just about how the Carolingian Empire, and then later, especially the political institutional mechanisms of the Holy Roman Empire worked like, right? This empire had virtually no power, right? It was mostly, a sum of princely powers put together for a specific aim that could mobilitate for those times enough critical mass to strike smaller entities and try to, however, still float on this enormous amount of communities that there was no way to control, right? In this way, the Hohenstaufen by the second half of the 12th century went pretty close, but pretty damn close, to simply conquer Constantinople. It's something that's very often not done. Henry VI was about to do it. To reunite East and West, Europe, Mediterranean, Universal Empire once again. We could argue in many ways Frederick II, so Frederick I and Henry VI respectively, grandson and son. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen went pretty, can say very close to that actually, but he's the one that went the closest was definitely Frederick I. But he's the one that conventionally is seen also for reasons that even here are historiographical and national. We're not nationalistic, because 19th century Germany certainly had its own impact in these terms, not completely wrongly, but largely wrongly, especially in the way and judgment on the Mediterranean policy of the Hohenstaufen, where they got completely wrong. which was extremely intelligent, actually, was seen as bit as the death of universalism itself. Frederick II embodied as a person was truly a unique figure, right? Easily one of the single most important figures, not just of the Middle Ages, but of the entire Western civilization. But that how many people actually care about him, right? Do you think that everything has been written about it? And the more we research on Frederick II, the more new things emerge about his figure, and that also gives you a dimension of how much Westerners do not know absolutely anything on average of their history. Easily, right? It's not a matter of saying, I do, because I don't either, right? Do you think that I know all this stuff, like I'm, an expert in all what I'm talking? Of course I'm not, but at least I recognize that there is an enormous problem here. So the mid-13th century, Frederick died in 1250, is normally considered the end of universalism. The Hohenstaufen in Germany had already essentially given up the idea of centralization. As you know, what they wanted to do essentially was to recreate a Roman Empire centered either in Palermo, preferably in Rome. Germany would have been just a peripheral province of it. The Mediterranean dream was not a chimera. It was, a very difficult thing, especially by the mid-13th century, to be even conceived. The Angevins tried that in many ways as well, but the crisis of this world system was setting in, and a lot of developments that, incidentally, I study mostly from a political and military point of view. That's also why I would like to talk a lot about Ludwig the Bavarian, which never actually done, or even Henry VII of Luxembourg, and other figures, including, of course, Charles IV, and also John of Bohemia. That all marked a very important step towards still that direction, right? That proves that universalism was not that. Of course, it wouldn't die throughout all the modern age, and that yet at some point was leaving space to other solutions that were necessarily required given a certain, situation of properly of political disorientation. As you know, the Hohenstaufen gradually faded. Eventually, they got properly extinguished in their main line with the death of Conrad was decapitated in the market square of Naples by Charles of Anjou, and especially the papacy, actually, because Charles even refused at the beginning to do it, because it was not a chivalric thing to do either. There is this legend that when he was just 16 or 17 at that point, I don't remember when he made the expedition in Italy, he was 16, but when he was decapitated, allegedly an eagle fell from the sky, touched with its claws, dipped his claws in the blood of the teenager, and rose up towards the sun, and once again to claim in many ways that was the imperial grandeur, what this world divine business had been. And there are similar legends also about the death of Frederick II. But there is a myth that's being developed about it that is important, because actually the people that lived in those times lived within the myth itself, right? They truly believed in it. There was a sincere passion. Very often when we look at this, we try to kind of secularize it and to make it, to disembellish it, I don't know, to define it. But actually there is an extensive amount of evidence, and I'm writing something about it right now. It could be also, beneficial to pointing it out that actually, and especially from the imperial side of the story, differently from the Guelph one, from the Papal Angevin side of the story, it was truly believed, and that in many ways took its own revenge. Revenge is a harsh word, but it took once again its important space, exactly in certain contexts, at least towards the 14th, the 15th century, also at the crisis of the same Guelph universalism that at that point was paraded by the church in the French Angevin alliance. That, of course, when Germany got pulverized in all these principalities, it lost all the the centrality in a property. There were some moments. Think about the Bohemia of Charles IV of Luxembourg, but it's still advanced stage of pulverization of many powers in Europe, so that there's a power like that could for some time catalyze control many important aspects of European culture. But it was momentarily, before the big crack of the mid-14th century, replaced by France. Like the big European empire in this time is is notoriously France, right? And it is an enormous system. France itself, but also its not properly dependencies, but allies, and were still the Angevins were just nothing but a branch of the Capetian dynasty. So from the Channel to Greece, there was this enormous crescent that crossed all France, Italy, and controlled basically the single most advanced, productive, rich, and advanced areas of Europe. And this is also what it would start aiming at, that universalistic policy. Also, Charles of Anjou was about to conquer Constantinople himself, and yet the crisis kicked in, and you can literally see these powers all over the continent simply contracting, like running out of energies, running out of resources to spend, and necessarily to reinvent themselves on another base, to control now also the very precarious equilibrium that they were facing within their own boundaries. The crisis of France is notorious. Think about the 100 Years' War, also other broader international reasons. That's where Germany revived a bit, and also there was a statalization of the Italian peninsula from the side of the local powers, and there is this new shape of different national powers by some degree, considering also the nations of those times specific, right? Especially if you take Germany or Italy, in there's a very few that, from at least a political institutional point of view, had specifically to do with the nations as we mean them, the modern countries today. But culturally speaking, there is something, actually a lot, and this is often underplayed also because of reasons of reciprocal, those discriminations we're talking about that take place, among Europeans even sometimes, and that are, when one just looked at banally, just if a person was literate in the sense that had studied literature, would be extremely, and this has nothing to do with classicism or elitism. We're talking about, studying those things linguistically and, culturally broadly meant, the exchanges and so on, would really think otherwise. But the empires, the concept of universal empire had worked, in my opinion, as long there were these two factors. The first one was naturally the lack of any other center specifically that could catalyze the, let's say, an oppositional dichotomy. That is to say, think about the Ottoman Empire, and this enormous power at some point rises and creates what we indirectly what we think as modern Europe narrowly meant, right? Or better, Western Europe narrowly meant, also in other terms. In Europe, there was nothing specifically like this. There were certain powers, as we've seen, that came once again to rose to prominence, then fell. They fell at some point. But here it's complex to explain. But the two factors can be exactly this: still growing system that allowed resources to be spent like an investment, to say, okay, let's give temporarily power to this sovereign and let's see if this can bring some benefit to us. Secondly, exactly this possibility of, because of the lack of any other major contendant in a in a complexively, in a continental theater broadly meant the possibility of literally floating over all these other communities and getting the power, right? How do you think the Ottonian Empire was created? Did the Ottonians actually control Germany or Italy? Or, yeah, they didn't. They didn't control even half of Germany. And they barely did in the territories that they actually controlled, right? The situation was extremely fluid. But it's exactly because of that this institution, this universal institution, could practically be seen as investment by the local powers to say, okay, I give you enough power to, police in this area, to go fight against, the Byzantines are bothering me now because they are re-expanding, in southern Italy or, in the Balkans. So let's re-increase. And it's all this kind of balance of power sometimes becomes really, really strong, right? And that is the same one that will bring in part actively to the destruction of all the resources that could have been used to form a more functional universalism that was utopistic in many ways. And the struggle for investitures had played an enormous role exactly in this, because it is true, as we have seen, that the church won. Let's be honest about it. There was surely a moment in which the same church lost the enormous power that at the beginning of the 13th century, basically every Western country was a vassal of Rome. Easily, right? We're talking about the papacy, right? By the mid-14th century, what is the papacy? Right? That is not to say that the Avignonese papacy wasn't powerful, or not that the German sovereigns weren't powerful at that point, or of course the Kingdom of France wasn't. But sure, their universalistic ambitions had sunk, right, pretty badly. That's why we will talk about how this happened on various fronts elsewhere. But it's important to stress the dichotomy that the secular and spiritual clash, let's say, had brought to this decrease, because by the beginning of the 14th century, basically it had been 2 centuries from the moment in which the recognition of the necessity of a double investiture had promoted the distinction of the ecclesiastical office of the bishops as shepherds of souls from their seigneurial attributes in the best of holders of properties and jurisdictions. This is particularly important because you know how the thing went with the Concordat of Worms in 1122. Basically, the thing was actually split, was not even technically just solely won by the church, because the emperor in Germany and the pope in Italy, that's how the thing geographically took form. Even though the papacy had technically no, that the papacy and any other secular repartition had nothing to do with them. Technically, sometimes we say, and I think I also said it sometimes, and I think that from the imperial side of the story was believed in part to be connected to it, but it was mostly the papacy was right in this regard. The papacy was not part of anything, was not part technically of a district of a kingdom, right? It was just something that went beyond any earthly possession. It wasn't, in this sense, technically part of the Kingdom of Italy. It wasn't part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was just the Church of Rome, right? And you know that after Worms, they switched the investitures. Like the emperor could appoint them in Germany. The papacy would choose the Italian bishopric, and the thing didn't stop there. As you know, these clashes went on forever. Actually, what is rarely stressed is that the struggle for investors began as soon as the the Roman Empire in the West began. That is, I'm talking about, was renewed, let's say, better with Charlemagne, right? I can't stand when people say, it was the foundation of a Holy Roman Empire at some point, right? Like in 962 with Otto I. It was the same thing all along. It wasn't even called that, to be honest. And it was the same empire, also because this is how you see how nationalism has really erased any intelligence in this. What's a universal empire if it's not one empire? There's not like a Holy Roman Empire, whatever, as it was also called like afterwards, of the Germanic nation. If it's a universal empire, it's the only possible empire existing all over the world. And it would all, tend to do that. And when, for example, the title of the Germanic nation was added, it's exactly because of what we're talking about now. That was with the emergence of a big word, German national consciousness, in awareness in terms, at least for, it was an aristocratic thing for managing the imperial college, and that's what it was. But it was emerging as something non-universalistically meant, or at least to be seen in national terms, because actually, since Ottonian times, we've seen it with that video from the passage from the Imperium Francorum to the Imperium Romanum Christianum. All the enormous problems that even only the concept of the idea that it was the Germans or the Romans that had owned the empire caused malaise among, for example, the Ottonian court, where there was properly an international scene in which, of course, the Ottonians had to claim themselves to be Roman, constitutively so, and to ask at all costs to become Roman, even just biologically, if we could say. Think about Otto III, that objectively was half German and half Byzantine, and a local, even in their national awareness, in the sense, it was the Germans that eventually took away from Rome in the West the Imperium, right? And that we are the ones who did it, right? And it's kind of ironic because, just to make an example, just even in Italy, they thought to be Germans, like Liutprand of Cremona, when he was sent as an ambassador, Otto I, to Constantinople, to John Zimisces, he think of himself not as a Roman. Even he spoke a Romance language, he was essentially an Italian, but he thought I'm a Longobarд, hence I'm a German. That also has naturally to do with with the only possible ethnic connotation of the times was juridical, right? Those people believed to be of a certain people because they shared their law, right? It was a big deal in even just in the political practice, and it's not a surprise in this sense that the struggle for investitures boosted dramatically the recovery of Roman law, as we perfectly know. Think about Frederick Barbarossa and the Bolognese school, all these jurists, these Romanists that flocked under him, just to support now the Roman prerogatives of an empire that, if it was a universal empire, could not but, of course, being the heir of Rome, it couldn't but be the Roman one, literally meant. As we were saying before, that's when the Hohenstaufen still believed they could make it realistically, right? So, in my opinion, the struggle for investitures is one of the single most overlooked phenomena in Western civilization. I mean, if it hadn't been for it, I doubt even the concept of the West would have existed in some ways, because this owes much naturally to Christianity and the monotheism in itself. But I mean, this separation between what concerns the spiritual matters and the earthly ones, that is not just a problem of conscience, but properly of, at that point, who rules in the name of what on a land. So the most concrete thing you can ever imagine that involves the whole political and social spectrum, whoever you are within it, right, brought this dramatic, powerful, juridical, philosophical, even artistical because it encompassed all the fields of civilization, development, massively, the spread at this point from these major centers in Christianity, in all this extremely intense debate. So we're talking specifically about Italy for what we're concerning, especially the juridical, let's say the lay juridical, but both actually, because the papacy was doing its own thing too, theologically speaking. But the Kingdom of France, right? We could insert other systems as well. The Kingdom of England already at the time contributed dramatically for what, in the future, but at that point nobody would say that the Kingdom of England, what the internal negotiations between the parliament and the people would bring eventually for the history of mankind. If the 7 Years' War had gone differently at this point, we wouldn't even think England of this great centrality, because up to that point objectively it hadn't had it in the European history, aside from its astonishing achievements. Even just think about during the 100 Years' War and so on. But France that remains a protagonist throughout all of European history as the major state ever, right? Since at least the time of Philip II, in a finally reunified fashion, but also with the claims that during Philip IV will bring exactly, even within the same French papal alliance, this contrast that will never make the alliance come less, because it was too dramatically useful for both of them, because that's where universalism was held on, but that was naturally creating this polarization between the horrible term polarization, by the way, but objectively, between the papacy and the king of France. It was starting to think not as a king of France, but simply as an emperor, right? And never underestimated the imperial horizons of any medieval power in this sense, and especially of France, where that sense of grandeur existed since the time of Clovis, right? But even here it's debatable, because of course someone will come up, but those were Germans, not in the modern sense. Like the Franks were Germans in the ancient sense, not in the modern sense, and surely probably what we can start calling Western Frankish element is the key for what eventually the empire spread like, historically speaking. Doesn't matter that the Carolingians were originally of Austrasia or whatever, the thing was in the West, the wealth was in the West, the education was in the West, right? Gaul had this enormous amount of resources. No country out there in Europe had it. No country like France. And it's even here it would be meaningful to stress how the system crumbled by the 14th century as well in France, and how in fact these attempts of making just making it a central monarchy or empire eventually kills in many ways the dynamism that instead by the 14th century we see dramatically. For example, in the Holy Roman Empire, you'd think Germany and Italy remaining all divided into these various principalities would remain pretty boring, right? That's where Italy and Germany at the end of the Middle Ages were the most technologically advanced countries in Europe. Think about humanism. Think about Florence as the cradle of the modern state as we think it, right? Even if it was just a city-state with but it had in that sense more to teach ideologically to the whole Kingdom of France, right? In terms at least of its technicalities, because the mystics, also the French monarchy, it's something that remains unbeaten, and that too should be understood very, very seriously and importantly in a historical perspective. But I don't want to trace too many parallelisms, because we can't reduce France just to the empire, right? Of course, also France had. It's so funny because I'm telling freely that I think that France was an empire. It objectively it was, right? And just making you buy that, without your consent. But I can assure you that that's exactly what it was, right? Except, of course, France was also a very complex system. And the France where I'm talking about specifically is the one north of the Loire and of what properly the Western Frankish kingdom, and it had conceptually, culturally, just linguistically, think about it, being right. The same processes go on in other places. Think about the Iberian Peninsula. Also, Spain was very advanced. I think Spain, the more I read about it, and the more I realize that it's one of the most dramatically overlooked country, in Europe in terms of during the low Middle Ages, especially. That shows certain features of advancement sometimes, even just technologically speaking, before, in fact, France or Italy. By the 12th century, we've seen it, for example, also with the equipment of the Spanish. But it's also a system on its own. Like, objectively, Spain is outside of this game because it's properly outside of the empire. Like, France, Germany, and Italy were the empire, right? Spain does something on its own. But even in there, of course, for the sake of this video, we see that amazingly Castilla and Aragon, and eventually also Portugal, start creating properly a state. Right? The documentation, I don't know if you ever studied the Acta Aragonensia, for example. It's a beautiful collection of the Aragonese correspondence, of royal correspondence, by the way, collected by Finca. But in Aragon, there were, very early in time, this enormous archives that were properly centralized under monarchy, which wasn't centralized at all, because that Aragon was the kingdom of Aragon, technically speaking, because that's just the historical region was pretty fluid. It was like a sort of confederacy, right? It was Castile, it was the real state. It was much more like France, just to stress a parallelism. It was properly a feudal power with a great institutional weight of the monarchy in its decisions, right? And even in there, you see properly that even if with different dynamics that are objectively kind of more continuous, in my opinion, compared to other countries in Europe, right? Because Germany. Think about the ethnic duchies of Germany at the time of the let's say the Carolingian conquest, right? It's by the end of the Middle Ages, yes, there was some kind of linguistic. Those were still historical regions, but the powers that were created on the base of them were very different in some ways. They reshaped in different forms. Italy the same, right? Had there ever been a Venetian state on the terra firma? Of course there was. It was ever kind of a Milanese state. The Longobard maybe kingdom was partially overlapped, but like what about Tuscany? I mean, yeah, these were these broader. There are also banally some major, these were older partitions in some way, but they had never taken a political institutional autonomy. The same goes for France, that technically, so the emergence in the same time which the Iberian Peninsula, certain realities were emerging, would remain essentially as Aragon, as Castile. Think about Leon and the Asturias, that's where it emerges from. Think about the Kingdom of Arles. There was the ancient Burgundy, or the same Aquitaine. I mean, those were also, and probably even more important, historical, especially Aquitaine, historical regions that had also a very intense culture on their own, but they were fundamentally overrun in some ways by the expansion of the French monarchy. So it's sort of very complex, really. That this is a point we should stress, the fluidity of political systems. Also, still by the 14th century in some areas of Europe, that are, and this is the amazing aspect of the Middle Ages, that are able to give themselves a balance a stability. This is astonishing, right? What the papacy had done was to, after the Concordato forms, on the Augustinian reflection of the dualistic and complementary relation between faith and reason that naturally coincide in God, had oriented itself in this radical direction of recomposition within itself of the unity of the plenitudo potestatis, which is properly the fulfillment, the full power, in terms properly of actual right of rule. In this, the Church had dramatically strengthened itself within its institutions, right? While the secular powers, as we've just seen, had remained fluid, right? The regnum, right? So the secular power as such, it was still a political and religious institution. This is important, right? This was not like in the Muslim world, in which every earthly power is seen negatively, where in another, and everybody is able to, is next to destabilize it, right? In Christianity, there was this idea, of course, that, authority was always contested, but at least it was recognized that whoever ruled had, was there because God had precisely wanted him, right? He was not an usurper of power, so it was a reverential respect in theory towards this, and that's also why, for example, the mysticism of the French market is, I don't even know how to define the greatness of that ideology, because it's the same thing. It's at the same base of, for example, Gothic architecture and the whole vision of the universe that transpires from whatever the Capetians and their ancestors had managed to create around Saint-Denis, Rheims, that contemplated the subservience of the secular power to the religious one. Of course, also in here, right? You know that the French kings were vassals of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and that's also why that's so meaningful. But still, also in there, in a very Gallic fashion, that will reemerge exactly in these years, because these are heavy concepts, because objectively the Saint Philip IV at the end of the 13th, beginning of 14th century, starts emanating this ideological primacy that makes it compete even with the same papacy in determining what the church had to be ruled, right? It's the same struggle of the investitures reproposed, but there was paralleled by an important crisis of the French kingdom. Think about all the economical imbalances of France during those years. The fact that this system had successfully expanded since the previous century, from the end of the 12th to the beginning, especially of the 13th century after Bouvines. But now, things were starting to go wrongly a bit everywhere, and this thing now had expanded so much, but it had to be kept together at some point. And this was the ambiguity, the indeterminateness, if you want, of the regnum, of the kingdom, right, of this political religious institution. Because banally, if you look at the Holy Roman Imperial policy, but also at the same French one, think about the famous, which probably never happened as such, the famous slap of Charles Colonna together with Philippe de Nogaret at Anagni in 1303 concretely, but they had stormed the papal palace, right? The Ghibellines, and together with the French envoys of Philip IV, right? Let's say they continued to intervene in the life of the church. The monarchs continued to intervene in the life of the church, universally and locally, right? As you know pretty well, in basically all the the Christian countries, as we've seen, the clergy had fundamentally backed the secular authority. And even if they were always in competition and even in contrast sometimes, think about Thomas Becket, or and that explains to you also how deep the papal interference actually was in all of this. For reasons that were fundamentally homogeneous also to the ones of the kings, just they had different forms in which they could express themselves. And therefore feeling it as almost as a duty, because of course the emperor, right, he held the imperium, but also any other secular ruler had the duty to protect the church, right? Albeit the struggle for investitures had concluded itself, or at least settled itself, chiefly with the victory of the church, in the measure in which, of course, the secular rulers had to accept their own exclusion from the religious government of the populations. Right? They couldn't, right, interfere. And why, according to you? Because, of course, even the local clergy that wanted to stay, relatively free from the papacy, that of course didn't have the means to literally control all of the local churches, wanted their own autonomy on their own. And very often also the card the papacy played in that regard, since they couldn't control them, was to grant them an immunity from of course the secular powers. And this was a bit why in ecclesiastical states existed until the secularizations of 1806, at the time of Napoleon, right? This is and beyond, I think also in the internal balance of the states in this regard, all the privileges that the church did maintain. This is still to be seen today, right? Think about the negotiations that Mussolini had with the Vatican that are still in force in today's Italy, in the sense that still the church had some specific privilege that at the time the Kingdom of Italy had to negotiate, and why? Also because, of course, in a Christian country, in a Catholic country, that was a big deal politically. So you see that there are always interests, even at very recent times, that are naturally to be played religiously, and that cannot stop to whatever the local ruler wants to do. Right? Think about Napoleon III in France, that had fundamentally secular policy, but had to side with the Catholics to a certain extent. Think about the same Bismarck, that was also came from a different position, and as a thinking about the problem of Protestantism and Catholicism in Germany. At a certain point, you had to reconcile the thing. We're talking about the monarchy, the nation state times. So you can imagine what this was like in the Middle Ages, where the state didn't have any, didn't properly even exist as we intended, and had a dramatically poor capacity. This is important, to look at the perspective of the people, the masses also, because the life of the people in the low Middle Ages was framed in these fluid political systems, right? And what is striking about that world is that these systems were usually even working well together. Like, it's not that they were always conflictual. Of course, they would be sometimes, but there was a sincere need of settling problems, recomposing the controversies, the church, the empire. But this is something that we often say. Of course, the secularized, modernistic, progressistic, ideologies have in many countries, and also because of specifically of, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, maybe just because it emerged from Protestant countries, historically had the vision, saying, the church was just a monster, were just oppressors. The church had a dramatically positive role in all of this. If there was a war among Christians, they would try to actually put it, to make it stop, right? They would have an actual say. Of course, they had their own interests in this regard, because being mediators brought to that, of course, to a lot of benefits. But properly, there was also a sense of recomposition that's what also, as we've seen before, the empire was in place, right? And it was not an empire like, a somewhat heavy presence like the Roman or Byzantine Empire eventually. It was just, as we've seen, sometimes even sort of fiction, right? The Holy Roman Empire was elective, right? And this theoretically meant that, if there was consensus, but, these people basically made a war for each time there was an election, because half of the electors disagreed and they elected someone else. Of course, they made the cunning thing of, making it 7, so that whatever the votes were, but that there could be also abstentions. But it's not the point. The point is that there were many other communities all over the empire that could have their own saying and oppose themselves. Sometimes even in arms to the emperors. Right? The Lombard League, at the end, they made it. They had Milan razed to the ground. They rebuilt it. They had several expeditions from the imperials to try to curb them. At the end of the day, they managed to earn their freedom. That's a big thing. Right, and that's how, normally speaking, thinking about even the Scots against the English, or all these various episodes of the Flemish against the King of France, when the big power knocks at someone's door, but he realizes that, of course, also its means are limited in a medieval reality, in that this fluidity is able to create new, parties, new factions that are able to hold out pretty strong, right? So all this produces the necessity also a steadier system, a more stable system, right? And a part of this that I didn't actually stress before is that as long as Europe was fundamentally poor, so that the local communities were weak enough, let's say, not to afford a government on their own, they would be willing to say, okay, let's accept an equally poor emperor as to at least, achieve this or that goal of maybe protection. Where these communities start being able to do them on their own, they say, why the hell should I stay under this power? The other factor said at the beginning, the fact that it was, throughout the low Middle Ages, an economical growth was important because, of course, at a certain point, these powers were able also to find enough power on their own to try to expand it further. It was always a negotiation with local powers, but universalistic goal was feasible at some point because there were enough resources after that. There weren't enough resources to be collected from the various communities, because you didn't have yourself the force to oppose them all together, right? And this is part of, important part of the reason why universalism came to an end in this measure. So there was a point, let's say, starting from which a public system managed to find within itself the reasons that justified its own existence. This is probably what starts the secularization of the process, right? Or to break the universalism, the spell of it. Why? Because, of course, at this point, these communities had reached enough autonomy, enough power to say, look, I can fundamentally do on my own. I don't need someone else's protection. I can maybe even expand on others and play in the same way a big empire did before, in my own little room that sometimes wasn't little at all, right? And this all started happening independently from the religious experience, right? On the contrary, actually instrumentalizing it at the ends of its own stabilization and preservation. That will mark basically the end of a long period of European history. Because you understand what this means. It means that if the struggle for investors, for example, was fought in a time because there was concretely the possibility of creating a universal empire, maybe not the perfection of the Christian society was meant, but properly an empire, a real one, there had already been. But of course, these powers would would struggle against each other, especially as far as the church was concerned, to say, look, the only reason I can oppose to you, since you're a Christian ruler and I'm the head of this church, is religious. That is to say, and that's how the papacy came out with the thing, came up with the thing saying, I can only decide whether you are fit or not to sit on that throne to bear that sword. If the various communities instead that were up to that point living within either the orbit or of one power or the other, actually was of both of them at the same time, but still, either pro-imperial, pro-papal, if you want, which also was never like quite a rigid, siding. Well, at that point, what's the importance of the religious struggle? Right? It can actually be implemented for very, utilitarian reasons, right? But not anymore in a properly universalistic sense, right? I don't know what Tyler and John Ball's revolt in England, maybe, of course, they all had kind of a universal background that the Christian world would always set its mind on, right? But that was perhaps a properly English problem, or the Hussites, if you say in English. Well, we have seen that there were lots of interspersed reasons had to do with the properly the emergence of a Bohemian, of a Czech national consciousness, and one cannot say, well, there wasn't anything like that, because it was created in that moment. Like, that was the goal, right? Of course, there was in part a pre-existing reason that was not decisive, but the creation of this idea that now, as a specific kingdom, for example, we're a specific country that has its own specific rules and its own maybe a religious address, right? It's an idea that a lot of sovereigns start toying with. Think about Gallicanism in France, right? That, France, the most Catholic country, the most powerful, at least in this hierarchy of power, Christian powers at that point, start saying to the papacy, we ask French kings, we want to rule our church on our own. That's also what Henry VIII will start, with the 16th century, and what more radically, in fact, some German states would do with the Reformation, and spreading throughout all, many other countries in Europe, and creating the Great Schism, right? That had already happened. Think about Constance and how, 1418, right? Since the 70s of the 14th century, there had been this great schism that at that point was revolving mostly on the contraposition between the Avignonese and the Roman papacy, but that, among the other things, was of course very nationally oriented. Think just about the Nationes, as it's called in Latin, of the conciliar fathers at the Council of Constance. So French, English, Germans, Italians, Spanish, right? That's a subdivision in nations that already existed since the time of universities, where the students of each nation would kind of create their own smaller university within it, its own guild, you could say. But it's undeniable that towards the late Middle Ages, this tendency of reshaping powers on a smaller base will surely give rise to the states, to the nations in the non-nationalistic sense of the word, that, of course, was emerged from the surpassing of the seigneurial fragmentation of power through the grandiose universalistic utopia of the Societas Christiana, right? The Christian society meant in an ecumenical sense. And this went throughout basically 3 centuries of statual experimentations, right? These things, as we've seen, the national monarchies started, emerging properly since the 12th century, at least some parts of Europe, by late medieval times, you can look at a political map of Europe and start recognizing most of modern countries, or at least what existed before their nation state, up to a very few centuries ago. So you realize how the thing crystallized, and part of the reason, which is very interesting indeed, is that it's even banally, I don't know, think about from the socio-economical point of view, how the crack of the great intercontinental trade of the 13th century across Eurasia brought to collapse of major financial capitals, how this stuff, how lots of people came back to the land, right? Properly local territorial wealth that had always been the base of the economy, but now comes back more prevalently on it, how the horizons of the economical crisis bring to the coming in let's say in the coming back properly to the local dimension, and the definition of your own prerogatives and identity on that local dimension. That's a serious issue, because literally certain powers will never recover the power they had by the 14th century economically, in absolute terms, up to the modern age. We're talking about enormous assets here. So this is really very important dimensionally to delineate, and it goes together. Also think about the crisis of the Black Death, the secularization of thought, in the sense of if people had ever fully believed in what the Christian vision of the world was, that was deeply shattered at some levels, because it's not about what you actually believe, namely in it. It's also how you start seeing the world after that you have lived in a situation in which you've seen people rotten in the street, and how 1/3 of your family wiped out by the plague, right? And that's something that changes deeply the vision of the world. Like, people's mindsets do not remain the same historically. And there is a need to justify and to reorganize, and that's why the crisis, also, we were talking about historiographically speaking before, it starts manifesting through the realization, the increase in awareness, in objectivity that you can realize in the medieval civilization. In the late Roman times, late antiquity, you see that basically there is something similar, that is the narrowing down of literature of to the elite, right? With humanism, as you know, the seigneurial context that in Europe in Middle Ages starts happening the same way. But in parallel, that middle class awareness remains and increases, and it's probably it's exactly that in a way reaches the top of the elite, right? There is properly the realization. It's as if these people had woken up from a nightmare and said, wow, this is the feeling I felt, this is the reality of the world I live in. Let me fix this. Like, let me create a system that makes me aware to cope with it in a more rational, more sensitive way, right? In previous times, it was all about like a broader gamble. At this time, they saw that the big system, the big game, the big civilization, the big economy that had been a big gamble had made everybody lose. So they realized that they had to go on in a different way, because simply there weren't the resources anymore. And that's the crisis that it generates actually an improvement. This partially happened also in the ancient world. So the ancient world anyhow exhausted itself and died out. Medieval civilization still kept increasing, still kept dramatically developing, right? Late Middle Ages with the Renaissance and so on, there is a sound expansion, there's a sound development. And that is the consequence of that crisis. It's difficult not to see it in that way. There are certain things specifically that even within the same crisis kept growing, right? Think about technological improvement. That's the most banal, but I don't know, there are many the same reinforcements of the statal capacities. That's something that was somewhat mandatory in a way, and this was also a matter of responsibility for those who had to rule locally, right? You couldn't at that point just invest in the big dream of the crusade, or to think to hegemonize an entire region of Europe simply by negotiation. Now, you needed literally the army to do just even to maintain a certain area next to you, and you couldn't avoid doing that. There would be a lot to add, thinking even about the 100 Years' War, how this problem was dramatic, like how the English, for example, achieved all their dramatic successes on the field thanks to a state that worked, and that wasn't the modern state. It was a pretty rudimentary thing, but still for that time was very advanced for medieval standard. They made it for that reason. How France managed to keep its act together and to even react and re-expand, that also stemmed from a crisis. The French decided that after all, I say the French as an approximation, because of course it was always someone in his that wouldn't want the thing, but the system held in exactly the moment of crisis. So if this system had been so fragile, it would have simply vanished. Instead, it didn't. France at the end of the 100 Years' War was the major power in Europe that revived dramatically and started doing things like invading Italy, for example, and triggering 60 years of war that engulfed the whole Europe in between, the Protestant Reformation, the Ottoman invasion. Let's be concrete about the Ottoman threat. Also, did partially the same thing. Think about the development of a maritime power now in a more stabilized fashion, in even the Mediterranean, that surely was on the lead in Europe for that already. But that gave a tremendous boost since the 11th century. Basically, the Mediterranean had been a Christian lake. Talking about half of a millennium. There are things that get settled in an important direction here. So what else could we say? There is, yes, of course, that as we were saying before, what the Council of Constance was concerned, the various nations of the Conciliar Fathers are a very meaningful sign of the contextual orientation towards the consolidation of national churches that were protected by princes and framed in the organization of the kingdoms and their own dominations, right? This caused at the vertex of Europe the opportunity to reformulate the rules and the relations of the Catholic elite and the national or regional powers. For example, through the stipulation of agreements, there were new peace bargains that basically established